Okay, so in the second of these two videos here, we're going to look at some specific nutrients here. I've changed my mind a little bit about all the things we'll end up covering, so we'll really focus here really just on proteins and fats, less on carbs. And we'll also take in some information here about mineral resources, vitamin resources, things like that. Because really those three things are more specifically important to the management aspect of what we're doing. Carbohydrates are vitally important. The nervous system of mammals, at the very least, cannot run without them, but they are really not usually a limiting resource for animals. And so we're going to worry less about those things. So we'll kick off here then, thinking about, here we go, proteins. Protein here, this is what your body's built out of, right? So when we talk about growth, when we talk about not just body growth, but growth of other structures, right? So growth of antlers or horns, growth of specific parts of the body, overall body growth, all of that kind of stuff. Protein is what drives that. Proteins are also extremely important because they are going to be a major component of the chemistry of the body. Right, so we talk about enzymes, we talk about chaperones, things like that. Those are also proteins. Those are also part of the sort of the metabolic side, as well as the construction side of the body. So protein is really, really important. And one of the things about proteins that makes them interesting is that they are all nitrogen based. Okay, and the reason we care about nitrogen basing here is that this is going to kind of give us a unique challenge to solve when it comes to getting rid of old proteins, amino acids that we're not using or whatever, because this is going to be expelled in the urine. And the loss of urine is important for us because the more nitrogen we have to get rid of, the more water we need to make urine. So that in and of itself kind of becomes a limiting factor for us along those lines. Now, obviously, because these are the building blocks of growth, protein requirements are the highest when you're growing. And they do tend to taper off as you get to be an adult, when you go to sort of the maintenance stage of your life, but you do still have fairly large protein requirements. In younger birds, for example, here, we're looking at 30% of the diet here goes to growth. Right? Whereas in adult birds, they're looking at about 12% of their diet being protein, just for maintenance, right? So these numbers here are a proportion of the total nutrient intake of their diet versus fats versus carbohydrates. Protein, obviously, we talked about this in the reproductive cycle here as well. If you are going to produce a new animal, you need to give it lots of protein to build itself out of, okay? Also, if you are a mammal, sort of post-parturition, post-birth here, a big part of the milk that is produced during lactation is milk proteins, okay? And so those also are required in addition to the maintenance protein for mom. In a very, very dire circumstance, we can begin to use protein for energy in a metabolic sense after the fats are depleted. However, the problem with this is that we don't actually store protein, right? We store fat as fat, right? We store carbohydrates as well as fat sometimes, but as things like glycogen. Protein stores, what this means is this is parts of your body. So we really don't want to find ourselves in a situation where we're using proteins metabolically, right? That is going to be literally removing parts of our body to keep our body alive. So that's really a very last-ditch requirement for us. Minerals and vitamins, these are going to be things that are required in very, very small quantities, okay? The difference between a mineral and a vitamin is the origin. Okay, so a mineral is not something produced by a biological organism. A vitamin is something produced by an animal. Okay, So a mineral will be something that you could pick up off the ground as a rock, right? But a vitamin is a compound produced metabolically by some animal. Now everybody's going to require some of these, right? Everybody's got different requirements for what minerals and what vitamins they need, and it may be at different times of the day or times of the year or times of life. Those will change, but there is going to be kind of a standard requirement for some of these things by everything. Now the good news is that in the wild, animals do a pretty good job at meeting their requirements, okay? So we don't often see in the wild major deficiencies in either of these things. We also don't see sort of overdosing on, right? Minerals and vitamins, again, remember, we need these things in very small quantities. So too much of them will actually potentially be harmful, right? But animals do a really, really good job at balancing this. Now, humans, we don't. We do a really lousy job at this, and so we are often deficient in a lot of things and toxic for others, particularly if we take a sort of a daily multivitamin. Toxicities can actually become an issue for us. 26 of the 90 things that we associate with minerals here are essential for life, okay, things that we are going to require to survive. So these would be things like calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and sodium. Where animals get these things? A lot of different places. Aquatic plants in particular, not just marine plants, but freshwater plants here also tend to be very salty. They have a lot of sodium within those. Animals will use both natural, what we call mineral licks, so certain rocks, simply by licking them, you can take the top layer of atoms off of that and get the nutrients that way. Obviously, if you run a farm or if you, for example, you can also place mineral licks out for deer. These are usually things like salt licks, but they can also, you can make a potassium lick, things like that, that are provided for animals to literally to lick and get minerals from. Then we also have things like trace elements, these things that we need, but not nearly as much. So things like iron, copper, fluoride, selenium, believe it or not, is something we need in very, very trace amounts as well. When it comes to fats, we're really going to focus on what we're going to call the essential fatty acids. Now here, we're going to use this term essential differently than we used it here, right? Here we meant that you require 26 of these things to live. Here, what we're going to talk about in terms of an essential fatty acid, this is the same thing that your aunt is talking about when she's trying to sell you essential oils, right? This is the essence of the thing, right? Not something that you need. Many of them are things that you do need, but here the essential part of this is that you cannot make this on your own. You have to get this directly from your diet. A non-essential fatty acid is a fatty acid that your body can make using parts from other fatty acids, okay? An essential fatty acid is one you cannot make, you have to get from your diet. And some of these will be saturated and some of these will be unsaturated, and we're really not going to worry so much about the difference between these two. Really all this comes down to is whether there are double bonds somewhere in the chain. If you want to know more about this kind of stuff, we can talk about it outside of the lecture period. We can take a different course, stuff like that. But here, just be aware that both of these can fall under the essential fatty acid bin. Where are we going to get these things? Typically from our plants, right? Most of the animals that we'll be talking about here in terms of management are going to be herbivores, okay? So they're going to get them from kind of a varied diet, right? So humans, for example, if we want to be vegetarian or vegan, we have to make sure that we get a sampling of both legumes, okay, and grains, okay, in order to make sure that we get all of the essential fatty acids and essential proteins and things from that. Here, with our herbivores, all of their essential nutrients can be met by their plant diet, right? And again, here, honestly, deficiencies are pretty rare. We don't usually see diets lacking these things in sufficient quantities. Right here, water may be surprising that we consider water here a nutrient for a couple of reasons. Number one, not every animal actually drinks water, right? And in fact, we're going to see that a lot of animals don't, or if they do, they only drink it rarely. And this might kind of go against some of your preconceived notions about management and water quality and things like that. But a lot of terrestrial animals really don't drink a ton of water. They get most of their water from the food that they eat. Okay, so particularly if you are an herbivore and you are eating plants, there is a lot of what we call preformed water, or water inside the plant cells and the plant structures. And so you don't have to necessarily get a drink, right, if you're eating a lot of these kinds of plants. Right? Now, if you're a carnivore, you may need more environmental water. Okay, you'll get less preformed water from your food, but you will still get some, right? Blood is somewhere around 60 to 70% water. Okay, extracellular fluids, intracellular fluids, again, mostly water. So you will get a lot of that water from the food. You don't need to drink nearly as much water as you might imagine. Now, they're still going to do it, so they do still need water, but really the water requirement here is mostly for plants and not actually for the animals themselves. Now, there are exceptions to this, right? Obviously, if you're lactating, you need more water, okay? And if we look at kind of this process here, sort of mating, development, birth, young of year class kind of behaviors, a lot of these things do track the availability of liquid water, not just because lactating moms need more water, but also because a lot of these young animals require a large amount of calories, right, from plants, and so they will track the green up in the spring is usually when births will occur. This is why we typically see a lot of births in roughly, not necessarily now, but a little bit later from now. Okay, so in terms of meeting these requirements, right, generally speaking, right, animals are going to kind of, depending on the season, meet their requirements in two different ways. If it's spring, summer, maybe fall, most of their requirements can be met by food, right? We talk about abundance in those times, and so they can come in and eat freely. But in addition to meeting their immediate requirements by food, then they're also going to have to build up bodily reserves, because come winter, those resources aren't going to be available anymore, right? And the resources that are available tend to be relatively low quality. And so they're going to have to kind of put things away on the pantry so that when it's January or February, even now in March, a lot of the good quality foods aren't present. They can sort of supplant, or kind of maybe even subsidize, maybe a better word to put it, the relatively crappy food that they can eat with the things that they put in store. Okay. Ultimately, their capacity to do these two things, right? To eat when it's abundant, to store when it's for when it's not, is going to essentially put a cap on, say, body mass and body condition. The better they are at eating when there's food available, the better they are at storing for later on, tend to be larger animals. And you can tell what animals are eating fairly easily, right? We can talk about using cameras, like trail cams are really, really, really common now. Used to be we'd have to go out and sit in the blind, not for fun reasons, but to go out and stare at animals and see what they were doing. Now we do a lot of this with video monitoring. We can also look at raptor pelts. Now these aren't like Jurassic Park raptors, obviously these are hawks, owls, things like that. And we can use these to see what these animals are eating, because they swallow the animal more or less whole. And they digest off all the good parts, and they kind of crap out the hair and the bones and the things that are undigestible. But we can take those remains and figure out what the animal was. And so we get a pretty good idea what birds are eating, at least raptorial birds are eating from that. Now, obviously, one of the things we've talked about here is that availability of food changes from month to month, from season to season, right? And so in order to compensate for that, herbivores and carnivores are going to do different things. Okay, so carnivores are going to switch what they eat. Right? They're going to eat different things. They're going to move from place to place to kind of maybe track the movements of the food that they want to eat, or really more commonly here, they're just going to eat less, right? They're really not going to have as much available food, and so they're just going to kind of slow down and do their best to kind of just ride out the winter. Herbivores, on the other hand, will do more movement. They will go to places where they can get food, even if it's low quality. Food is food, right? And so you'll see a lot of animals that may be edge species or open area species moving into the forest where things like mast, right? So nuts are maybe more available. We'll see a lot of animals switching to things that are not very nutritious, like bark. Okay, deer will eat a lot of bark at this time. Again, just to try to get some calories, even if they're not necessarily what they really want. Okay. So they are very much kind of limited in what's available to them, right? Now, as food becomes more available, obviously they're going to eat more of it. This accounts for both carnivores and herbivores. Again, the idea here is that when it's plentiful, they're going to eat and they're going to store for later. When it's not plentiful, they'll have that stuff in storage. It's not very costly to them to eat a bunch when there's a lot available, and they get a big benefit out of it. So again, this is explainable under relatively simple economic models. There are also going to be other sorts of things that kind of trigger food intake, right? So if you are coming into mating season, for example, oftentimes there your elevated caloric requirement will cause you to eat more, right? So things like that. When it comes down to what animals are eating and how they're eating, are some, I think, relatively straightforward ideas behind a lot of this stuff. If we look at, say, the difference between a cow skull and a deer skull, for example. Cow's got a very big, broad snout, right? It's got a big, wide mouth. A deer has a relatively narrow mouth. And the reason between those two animals, the reasons the difference between those two animals comes down to the idea that they're eating different things, right? A deer tends to eat smaller bites of things that are more nutritious, right? They're more easy to digest, they maybe have more available nutrients, all that kind of good stuff. And so they don't need to eat a lot, they just need to eat better stuff. Cows, on the other hand, and sheep, other grazing animals, eat really low quality food. They eat grass is awful as a food, but there's a lot of it, right? And so they need to get a big mouthful every time they bite in order to kind of meet the same calorie requirements as maybe eating a piece of fruit or a leaf or a shoot would for the deer. So they're going to have larger bites to kind of compensate for the relatively crappy food that they're getting. Things that are better tend to be selected for. I don't think that's going to surprise you, right? The same thing happens when you go into a restaurant, right? If you see something on there that sounds pretty awful, you're not going to order it very often, right? But if something sounds really good, you'll preferentially pick that. And animals do the same thing. When we talk about how much they're going to end up eating, right, we're looking at somewhere between 2, for say a carnivore, up to maybe 10% of body weight for an herbivore for daily intake. And the reason for this is that if a carnivore is eating, they're eating animal protein, right? And it's very simple to take animal protein and turn it into more animal protein, right? If you're eating plant protein, on the other hand, number one, it's hard to digest, so you get less calories out of the same weight of food. But you also have to convert it to proteins that you can use, and that costs extra energy. And so they would find that herbivores tend to have to eat more than carnivores do to kind of meet their requirements. And obviously these things, again, other physiological behaviors here, if they're going on a migratory journey where food might be limited, energy expenditure is high, you're going to stock up for that, or also, of course, for hibernation or torpor. Now, when it comes to management here, really our biggest thing is trying to figure out how to make sure they get quality food. Okay, it's not easy to figure out what makes food good, right? We have to do a lot of observation. We can do clinical trials in terms of trying to figure out the caloric content, all that kind of stuff. the other half of this too is that it different between different times of the year or different parts of the plant. Not every plant part is useful, right? And so one of the things that we have to kind of balance off then when we manage for things is that sometimes we're going to have to make the decision to say we're going to make sure there's a lot of food, even if it sucks, right? We need to meet calories somehow. So if we can't give them the best food that we can, right, the highest quality food that we can at least give them a lot of shitty food, which is not ideal, right, but it will keep them alive, which is ultimately kind of what we're doing. We are going to assess how successful any of these things are by looking at body condition, right? And you can do this simply, right? You can go out and you can tell the difference between, you're out hunting, right? You can see a deer that looks nice and happy and healthy, and you can see a deer that is really struggling, right? Body condition is often very, very apparent. Now, it's trickier in carnivores because carnivores tend to do their best to mask poor condition. They try not to appear weak as best as they possibly can. And you know, if you have pets at home, you have cats and dogs, they're both carnivores. They tend to not let you know when they're sick. They try to hide it, right? And so assessing body condition in predators is more difficult than assessing body condition in herbivores, but it can still be done. And again, here the big idea, right, is we're just going to try to see, are they meeting their basic requirements? Are they healthy? If they're not, we're going to see consequences for reproduction, right? And consequences for reproduction then turn into lowered population sizes. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If we need to bring population sizes down, it's a bad thing from sort of a ethical standpoint because it means they're going to starve and die, but it can be a management tool. We can also assess this with bodily fluid samples. So we can take urine samples, blood samples. We can trap them and physically measure them, particularly things like body fat, right? If we have a dead animal, right? If we had a sacrificed animal or we've got other sorts of mortalities, we can look at internal structures, right? So the amount of fat in and around the body, right? So fat surrounding the kidneys, overall body fat. If we have a bird, we can look at the fat surrounding the gizzard, stuff like that. We can also do ultrasounds, electrical conductivity studies. This stuff, I don't have the budget for this. You don't have the budget for this. We're not going to do this, right? If you live in a zoo, right, and you work in a zoo, maybe. But for the rest of the world, we're stuck with this stuff. If we have really good data, most of the time we're just looking at sort of direct observational stuff. So to kind of bring it all together here, you know, obviously everything that we do, both in terms of management activities, but also life in general, right, is a cost-benefit analysis, right? What is the biggest benefit for the littlest cost that we can possibly get, right? And you know, you do this when you go shopping. Animals do this subconsciously when they're trying to live, right? And so what we'll find is that a lot of animals adopt different seasonal strategies, particularly sort of here in this part of the world where we have very distinct seasons. Again, just to try to minimize costs and benefits. These seasonal strategies also, however, can be present for mating seasons, right? They don't have to be climate type seasons. They can be simply behavioral seasons as well, migration seasons, things like that. So if we bring it all kind of in final summary here, we need to be aware of nutrient requirements for the animals that we're studying. We need to be aware of what kinds of foods fit them best, what their behavioral strategies are during different times of the year. And all of these things are important because if we're trying to manage for a healthy herd size, we need to be aware of how to do that, right? You can't just go out and hand them a protein shake and call it a day. The way that we manage for these things is by managing for their environment. All right, so if we know that we need a herd size of a certain amount, and we know that in the winter they rely heavily on mast crops, things like acorns, we need to make sure that we're planting trees that have acorn drops, right? We might need to go out and actively drop acorns, right? All of these sorts of things, we need to understand them. And we need to understand the timing when these nutritional requirements change so that we can change our management strategies accordingly. Okay, so from there, we can move on to our next chapter, which is going to be kind of a continuation of the same idea, a little more management driven, but kind of building off a lot of these ideas.